Millionaire finds a boy selling Christmas cards at the traffic lights, but is shocked to find out who he is. In the heart of bustling Chicago, a young boy selling hand-drawn Christmas cards at a busy intersection captures the attention of Maggie West, a woman whose world seems far removed from his struggles. What begins as a fleeting act of kindness soon spirals into a journey that challenges everything Maggie thought she knew about family, love, and resilience. With secrets, unexpected connections, and lives hanging in delicate balance, this is a story that asks, how far would you go to give someone a second chance at hope? The rain poured over San Francisco, blanketing the streets in a shimmering gray haze. Margaret Maggie Whitmore gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black Tesla, weaving through the city's bustling downtown traffic. Nob Hill's stately mansions and gleaming storefronts faded behind her as she approached the less glamorous streets near Mission District. The glowing red of a traffic light forced her to stop, and for a moment, the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers was the only sound in her world. As she waited, Maggie's gaze wandered. Her eyes caught sight of a small figure moving between cars. A boy, no older than 9, holding a stack of colorful cards in his hands. He wore a threadbare hoodie that sagged on his slim frame, soaked from the relentless rain. His sneakers were scuffed, the soles peeling away, and his hair clung to his forehead in damp clumps. Despite his obvious discomfort, the boy smiled at each driver, his face lighting up with hope as he approached their windows. Maggie's chest tightened. She couldn't explain why this scene affected her so deeply. San Francisco was no stranger to hardship. Every day, she passed unhoused individuals and struggling families. Yet, there was something about this boy, his determination, his vulnerability, that made her roll down her window as he neared her car. "Cards for Christmas, ma'am. Only $2, the boy said, his voice barely audible over the rain. His smile was tentative, but his eyes held a quiet resilience. Maggie hesitated. She wasn't one to buy items from street vendors, let alone a child. But something in his expression, the quiet plea behind his words, struck her. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Eli," he replied, clutching the cards tighter. "Do you want one?" Maggie studied him for a moment, ignoring the impatient honks from cars behind her. "I'll take all of them," she said, reaching into her purse for cash. Eli's eyes widened as she handed him a $20 bill. "I don't have change," he stammered, his voice uncertain. "Keep it," Maggie said, her tone firm. "What are you doing out here in this weather, Eli?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though afraid someone might overhear. "My mom's sick. I'm selling these to buy her medicine." The traffic light turned green, and the cars behind Maggie blared their horns. She ignored them, her focus solely on Eli. "Where's your mom?" Eli pointed toward a street lined with dilapidated apartment buildings, their facades cracked and stained. "We live over there," he said. "I need to go now. Thanks for buying the cards." Before she could say another word, Eli darted away, disappearing into the rain-soaked streets. Maggie sat frozen, the honking horns and impatient shouts around her fading into background noise. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind racing. The light turned red again, and still, Maggie didn't move. A part of her screamed to drive away, to forget the encounter and return to her meticulously curated life. Yet, she couldn't shake the image of Eli's face, the resilience in his voice, the quiet desperation in his eyes. By the time the light turned green again, Maggie had made her decision. She turned her car toward Mission District, her chest heavy with an inexplicable urgency. She didn't know what she would find or what she could do to help, but she knew she had to try. As the rain continued to pour, Maggie parked her car on a narrow street flanked by rundown buildings. The smell of damp concrete and cooking grease hung heavy in the air. She pulled her trench coat tighter around herself as she stepped onto the slick sidewalk. The echoes of children's laughter mixed with the occasional shout from an open window. Maggie walked cautiously, scanning the dimly lit alleyways until she spotted Eli. He stood under the faint glow of a street lamp, counting his meager earnings. His shoulders were hunched, his small frame shivering against the cold. "Eli," Maggie called out, her voice carrying across the street. The boy startled, clutching the money in his hands as if she might take it from him. "You followed me?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," she said, taking a step closer. "You said your mom was sick. Can I meet her?" Eli hesitated, his expression wavering between mistrust and hope. "Why do you care?" The question caught Maggie off guard. She didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense to him. "Because I can help," she said finally. Eli studied her, his brown eyes searching her face for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded, motioning for her to follow. "She's at home." "But it's not much," he warned, his voice tinged with embarrassment. Maggie followed Eli through a narrow alley and up a flight of crumbling stairs. The air grew colder, and the sound of dripping water echoed against the walls. At the top of the stairs, Eli pushed open a door, revealing a dimly lit apartment. The space was small and cluttered, with peeling wallpaper and a sagging ceiling. In the corner, a frail woman lay on a worn-out couch, her skin pale and her breath shallow. Maggie's heart clenched as Eli rushed to her side. "Mom, I'm back," he said, kneeling beside her and holding her hand. "This lady wants to help us." The woman's eyes fluttered open, her gaze settling on Maggie. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the woman said, "Why would you help strangers?" Maggie stepped closer, her throat tight. "Because I've spent so much time ignoring people who needed it. Maybe it's time I changed that." Eli's mother gave a faint smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Maggie knew in that moment that this encounter would change her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Maggie couldn't shake the image of Eli from her mind. As she stood by the window of her elegant Nob Hill townhouse, sipping her morning coffee, the boy's wide eyes and tentative smile replayed in her memory. Her life, normally filled with the demands of running her prestigious ballet school and maintaining her social image, felt oddly hollow that day. She glanced at the stack of colorful Christmas cards Eli had sold her, sitting neatly on her kitchen counter. Their simple designs, snowmen, candy canes, and stars, seemed out of place in her meticulously styled home. By mid-afternoon, Maggie could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that had been growing in her chest since their encounter. She slipped on a pair of practical shoes, draped herself in a beige trench coat, and headed out. The pristine streets of Nob Hill faded into the chaotic vibrancy of Mission District as she drove, each turn of the wheel amplifying her unease. When Maggie arrived at the same street where she had last seen Eli, she parked her car and walked cautiously along the cracked sidewalks. The rain had cleared, but the sky remained overcast, casting a dull gray light over the neighborhood. The smell of fried food and exhaust filled the air, and the muffled hum of distant traffic mixed with voices from open windows. After a few minutes of searching, Maggie spotted Eli sitting on the stoop of a rundown apartment building, clutching the same worn hoodie around his thin frame. His hair was slightly less disheveled than the day before, but his expression carried the same guarded exhaustion. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Eli," she called softly. The boy looked up, his eyes narrowing in recognition. He clutched a small paper bag closer to his chest, as if protecting its contents. "You again?" he asked, his tone both wary and curious. Maggie smiled gently, stopping a few steps away. "I wanted to check on you and your mom. Is she feeling any better?" Eli shrugged, glancing down at the bag in his hands. "She's the same. She's always the same." Maggie tilted her head, trying to read his expression. "Can I see her? Maybe there's something I can do to help." The boy's grip on the bag tightened, and he looked away, chewing on his lower lip. "Why do you care? You don't even know us." "I care because no one else seems to," Maggie said, her voice soft but firm. "And sometimes we all need someone to care, even if it's a stranger." Eli looked at her for a long moment, his young face unreadable. Finally, he stood and nodded toward the apartment door. She's inside. But it's not nice like your house or anything. Maggie followed him up the creaking stairs, her polished shoes clashing with the worn wood. The air inside the building was heavy with the smell of mildew and stale cooking oil. When they reached the apartment door, Eli pushed it open carefully. Inside, the small space was dimly lit and sparsely furnished. A single couch sat against one wall, its fabric fraying at the edges. A folding table with mismatched chairs occupied the center of the room, and in the corner, an old radiator clicked and hissed weakly. Maggie's eyes were drawn to the couch, where Isabel lay under a thin blanket. Her face was pale, her cheeks hollow, and her breathing shallow. "Mom," Eli said, his voice soft but urgent. "That lady I told you about yesterday, she's here." Isabel's eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head slowly to look at Maggie. Her gaze was heavy with both exhaustion and suspicion. "Why would you come back?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Maggie stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the worn linoleum floor. I wanted to see how you were doing. Eli said you weren't feeling well." A faint, humorless smile crossed Isabel's lips. "Not feeling well is putting it lightly." Maggie hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Is there anything you need? Medicine? Food? I can help." Isabel's eyes narrowed, and she pushed herself up slightly on the couch, wincing as she did so. "People like you don't help people like us without wanting something in return. So, what is it?" Eli glanced nervously between his mother and Maggie, clutching the paper bag tighter. "Mom, she's nice. She bought all my cards yesterday and didn't even ask for change." Isabel sighed, her frail shoulders slumping. "That's sweet, Eli, but the world doesn't work that way." Maggie knelt by the couch, meeting Isabel's wary gaze. "Look, I don't expect anything in return. I just want to help. Please let me." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hissing of the radiator. Finally, Isabel nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We could use some groceries," she admitted. "And there's medicine I need, but it's expensive." Maggie nodded. "Tell me what you need, and I'll take care of it." Eli's face lit up with cautious hope as he handed Maggie the paper bag. Inside was a crumpled prescription note and a list of basic food items written in a shaky hand. Maggie's heart tightened as she read it. Eggs, bread, rice, and ibuprofen. Nothing extravagant, just the bare essentials. "I'll be back soon," Maggie promised, standing and heading toward the door. "Eli, stay here and keep your mom company." Eli nodded, his small hand gripping his mother's. As Maggie stepped out into the cold air again, she couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her. These were people who had been left behind, invisible to the bustling world around them. She drove to the nearest pharmacy, her mind racing. She had spent her life surrounded by privilege, never worrying about where her next meal would come from or how she would afford health care. Yet here was a family on the brink, fighting a battle they had no chance of winning alone. At the pharmacy, Maggie handed the prescription to the pharmacist, who raised an eyebrow at the total. "It'll be $150, he said. Maggie didn't flinch. She handed over her credit card, ignoring the pang of guilt that came with knowing how easily she could afford what to others was a crippling expense. She loaded her car with groceries from the market and returned to the apartment. Eli's face lit up when he saw her carrying bags through the door. "Wow, that's a lot of food," he exclaimed, rushing to help her. Isabel tried to sit up, her frailty even more apparent under the harsh light of day. "You didn't have to do all this," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to," Maggie said simply. "And this is just the beginning. I'm going to make sure you have what you need." For the first time, Isabel's guarded expression softened into something resembling gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. As Maggie left that evening, Eli ran to the door to wave goodbye. "You're coming back, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with hope. Maggie smiled and nodded. "I'll be back soon, Eli. Take care of your mom." As she drove home, Maggie felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Helping Isabel and Eli had filled a void she hadn't even realized existed. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would test her in ways she wasn't yet prepared for. The following day, Maggie sat in her sunlit office at the ballet school, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The usual hum of activity outside her door, students chattering, the piano accompanying practice sessions, was oddly distant. Her thoughts were consumed by the worn faces of Eli and Isabel. She had spent most of the night replaying their conversation, trying to reconcile the stark contrast between their world and hers. She was jolted from her thoughts by the buzz of her phone. Andrew's name flashed on the screen. Maggie hesitated, then answered, keeping her voice neutral. "Andrew," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Maggie," he replied, his tone brisk. "I was hoping to confirm our dinner plans for tonight. Are we still on?" Maggie hesitated, her gaze drifting to the prescription note she had tucked into her planner. "Actually, something came up. I'm not sure I'll make it." Andrew's pause was slight, but telling. "Something came up," he repeated, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Yes, I'll explain later," she said, ending the call before he could probe further. Later that evening, Maggie found herself returning to the modest apartment in Mission District, her car loaded with fresh groceries and a new supply of medication for Isabel. She parked on a narrow street, her polished heels clicking against the uneven pavement as she carried the bags upstairs. Eli greeted her at the door, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "You came back." "I said I would, didn't I?" Maggie replied with a small smile, stepping inside. Isabel was sitting up on the couch this time, looking slightly better, though still frail. "I didn't expect you to keep showing up," Isabel said, her voice soft but steady. "Well, I've always been stubborn," Maggie replied, placing the bags on the small table. As she unpacked, Isabel's eyes caught on Maggie's well-tailored coat and the subtle sparkle of her jewelry. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked. "No," Maggie admitted, setting a carton of eggs on the counter. "I live in Nob Hill." Isabel chuckled dryly. "Figures. So, what made you decide to save us poor folks?" Maggie paused, her hands resting on a loaf of bread. "I don't know. Maybe I needed saving too." The vulnerability in her voice seemed to disarm Isabel, who nodded silently. Maggie turned to Eli, who was already sorting the groceries into the cupboards. "You're quite the helper," she said, ruffling his hair. He grinned. "Mom says I have earned my keep." Later that night, as Maggie drove home, her mind wandered to Andrew. She realized she couldn't keep him in the dark. There was something gnawing at her, an unsettling connection she couldn't ignore. The next morning over breakfast, Maggie decided to confront Andrew. He sat across from her at their marble dining table. Scrolling through his phone, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. "Andrew," she began, her tone hesitant. He murmured, not looking up. "I met a boy," she said, watching his reaction carefully. His fingers froze, and he set the phone down slowly, finally meeting her gaze. "What kind of boy?" he asked, his voice cautious. Maggie hesitated, unsure of how to frame her next words. "A boy selling Christmas cards near Mission District. His name is Eli. He's special." Andrew's face paled slightly and his jaw tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think there's more to this than coincidence," Maggie said, her voice firming. "His mother's name is Isabel. She's ill, Andrew. And Eli, he has a birthmark on his neck, one that looks strikingly familiar." The color drained from Andrew's face completely, and he leaned back in his chair as if the weight of her words had physically struck him. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, avoiding her piercing gaze. "Maggie," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you." She crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening." Andrew exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging. "Before I met you, I was married." Her name was Isabel. Maggie felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to stay composed. "We were young," Andrew continued, his voice tinged with regret. "It was a messy relationship, and when she got pregnant, I panicked. I wasn't ready to be a father. I wasn't ready for any of it. So you left," Maggie said flatly, her voice void of emotion. Andrew nodded, his eyes downcast. "I made excuses, pushed her away. I thought if I just disappeared, she'd be better off without me. I told myself I wasn't capable of being the man she needed. And Eli," Maggie pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you even know him? Did you ever try to see him?" "No," Andrew admitted, his voice cracking. "I didn't. I convinced myself it was better that way. But I was wrong. God, Maggie, I've regretted it every day since." Maggie sat back, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "So, you've been living in comfort all these years while Isabel and Eli struggled to survive. And you didn't think to tell me any of this." Andrew flinched at the bitterness in her tone. "I didn't know how. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would go away. But it didn't." Maggie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Well, it didn't go away for them either, Andrew. They've been suffering while you build a life for yourself. And now, you have a chance to do something about it. The question is, will you?" Andrew stared at her, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. "What do you want me to do?" "For starters," Maggie said, her voice steely, "you need to meet your son. And you need to decide whether you're ready to be a part of his life, because he deserves better than half measures." Andrew nodded slowly, his face etched with remorse. "You're right. I owe them that much." As Maggie left the table, her heart was heavy with the weight of Andrew's confession. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was determined to help Isabel and Eli, no matter how complicated things became. That evening, she returned to the small apartment in Mission District, her mind racing with everything Andrew had told her. Isabel greeted her with a weak smile, and Eli ran to her side, his face lighting up as usual. "Did you bring more groceries?" he asked eagerly. Maggie knelt down, her hands resting on his small shoulders. "Not today," she said gently, "but I brought something more important. Eli, there's someone I think you should meet." Eli frowned, his youthful curiosity giving way to confusion. "Who?" Maggie hesitated, glancing at Isabel, whose expression shifted to one of cautious suspicion. Taking a deep breath, Maggie replied, "Your father." Eli's eyes widened, and Isabel froze, her frail hand clutching the blanket tightly. The room fell silent, the weight of Maggie's words hanging heavily in the air. As Eli's confused gaze darted between Maggie and his mother, Maggie braced herself for what would come next. She knew the path ahead would be tumultuous, but it was one they could no longer avoid. The air in Isabel's cramped apartment grew thick with tension as Maggie's words hung in the air. Eli's eyes darted between Maggie and Isabel, his expression a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. His small hands gripped the hem of his hoodie, his knuckles white. "What do you mean, my father?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabel looked down, her frail shoulders trembling. She inhaled sharply and tried to compose herself, but the effort seemed to drain what little strength she had. "Eli's sweetheart," she began, her voice cracking. "I was going to tell you someday, but I didn't know how or when." "You told me he was gone," Eli said, his voice rising slightly. "You said he didn't care about us." Isabel's face crumpled, and tears welled in her tired eyes. "I didn't want you to grow up waiting for someone who might never come back," she said. "I wanted to protect you." Maggie knelt beside Eli, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your father made mistakes," she said carefully, "but he knows about you now, and he wants to make things right." Eli's wide eyes filled with tears, and he pulled away from Maggie's touch. "Why now? Why does he care all of a sudden?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Isabel reached out for her son, her weak hand brushing against his arm. "He's here because of you, Eli," she said. "Because you're worth it. You've always been worth it." Before Eli could respond, the sound of a knock at the door echoed through the apartment. Maggie rose to answer it, her stomach twisting with anticipation. When she opened the door, Andrew stood on the other side, his tall frame rigid, his face pale with tension. "Andrew," Maggie said, stepping aside to let him in. Andrew's eyes swept the room, landing first on Isabel, then on Eli. His breath caught as he took in the sight of the small boy standing in the dim light, his face streaked with tears. "Eli," Andrew said, his voice soft and unsteady. "I'm your father." Eli stared at him, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room was deafening. Maggie watched as Andrew took a tentative step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Andrew continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I've made a lot of mistakes, and leaving you and your mom was the worst one of all. But I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me." Eli's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He turned and ran into the small bedroom at the back of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Andrew flinched at the sound, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I shouldn't have come," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "You needed to," Maggie said firmly, "but it's going to take time." Isabel sighed, leaning back against the couch. "He's been through so much," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. "I didn't want him to carry this kind of pain." Andrew stepped closer to her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, Isabel," he said. "I know an apology isn't enough, but I mean it. I'm sorry for everything." Isabel nodded faintly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's not me you need to convince," she said. For the next few days, Maggie became a constant presence in Isabel and Eli's lives. She brought meals, picked up medications, and did what she could to create a sense of stability. Andrew visited as often as he could, though Eli refused to speak to him, retreating to his room whenever his father appeared. One afternoon, as Maggie helped Isabel organize a small pile of medical papers, Isabel's breath hitched, and she pressed a hand to her chest. Maggie rushed to her side, alarmed by the sudden pallor in her face. "Isabel, are you okay?" Maggie asked, steadying her. "I'm fine," Isabel said weakly, though her labored breathing betrayed her words. "Just give me a moment." Maggie glanced at the prescription bottles on the table, her concern growing. "You need to see a doctor. This isn't something you can ignore." Isabel shook her head, her eyes glassy. "I can't afford it," she said. "And even if I could, what's the point? It's too late." "It's not too late," Maggie insisted, her voice firm. "You need help, Isabel. Let me take you to a clinic. Please." Isabel hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the bedroom door, where Eli's muffled voice could be heard as he played quietly. "I don't want him to see me like this," she said. Maggie placed a reassuring hand on Isabel's arm. "I'll make sure he's taken care of. You don't have to do this alone." Reluctantly, Isabel agreed, and Maggie arranged for her to be seen at a nearby clinic. The doctor's prognosis was grim. Isabel's condition had worsened significantly, and her heart was failing. She needed a transplant, but the chances of securing one in time were slim. As they returned to the apartment, Isabel's face was a mask of resignation. "How am I supposed to tell Eli?" she asked quietly. Maggie's heart ached for her, but she didn't have an answer. She could only promise to stand by her side, no matter what came next. That evening, Maggie sat with Eli at the kitchen table, watching as he sketched a colorful picture of a house with a garden. His small hand moved the crayons with precision, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrated. "Who's that in the picture?" Maggie asked, pointing to the three figures standing in front of the house. "That's me, Mom, and you?" Eli said matter-of-factly, coloring in the flowers around their feet. Maggie's throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she said softly. As the days passed, Isabel's strength continued to fade. She spent most of her time resting on the couch, her voice growing weaker with each passing hour. One night, she called Maggie over, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I need you to promise me something," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "Anything," Maggie replied, kneeling beside her. "Take care of Eli," Isabel said. "He needs someone who will love him, someone who will fight for him when I'm gone." Maggie's chest tightened, and she placed a hand over Isabel's. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to get through this." But Isabel shook her head. "We both know that's not true. Please, Maggie, promise me." Tears filled Maggie's eyes as she nodded. "I promise," she whispered. The next morning, Isabel handed Maggie a sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me, give this to Eli," she said. "He deserves to know how much I love him." Maggie accepted the envelope with a heavy heart, tucking it carefully into her bag. She knew the weight of Isabel's words would stay with her long after this moment, a reminder of the promise she had made. That evening, Isabel fell into a deep sleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. Maggie sat beside her, holding her hand as Eli slept in the next room. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radiator. As dawn broke, Isabel's breath slowed, then stopped altogether. Maggie's tears fell freely as she gently placed a hand on Isabel's still chest, her heart breaking for the woman who had fought so hard for so long. Maggie wiped her tears, knowing she had to be strong for Eli. She walked to his room and knelt beside his bed, brushing his hair back as he stirred awake. "Eli," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something." As Eli blinked up at her, his small face still drowsy, Maggie braced herself for the hardest conversation she would ever have. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the apartment, casting faint patterns on the walls. Maggie sat on the edge of Eli's small bed, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed his blanket. The boy blinked up at her, his hair tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep. For a brief moment, Maggie hesitated, wishing she could shield him from the truth for just a little longer. "Eli," she began softly, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "I need to tell you something about your mom." Eli rubbed his eyes, sitting up against the headboard. "What is it?" he asked, his voice groggy but laced with curiosity. Maggie inhaled deeply, her chest tightening. "Your mom, she was very tired. She fought so hard for you, Eli. She loved you more than anything in this world. But last night, her body couldn't keep fighting." The words hung in the air like a weight too heavy to bear. Eli stared at her, his small face a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie reached for his hand, holding it tightly between her own. "She's gone, sweetheart. She's at peace now, but she's not coming back." Eli's eyes widened, his lip trembling as the full weight of her words sank in. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, you're lying. She said she was going to get better. She promised." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, but she forced herself to stay composed. "She didn't want to leave you, Eli," she said, her voice cracking. "She tried so hard to stay. But she wanted you to know how much she loves you, and she wanted you to be happy." Eli pulled his hand away, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want her to be gone," he shouted, his small frame shaking with sobs. "I want my mom back." Maggie reached for him, pulling him into a tight embrace as he cried against her shoulder. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking his hair. "I know it hurts, but I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere." The boy clung to her as if she were a lifeline, his grief raw and unfiltered. They sat like that for what felt like hours, the apartment silent except for Eli's broken sobs. Maggie held him, her own tears falling as she silently vowed to fulfill the promise she had made to Isabel. Later that day, Maggie began the difficult task of arranging Isabel's funeral. She made the necessary calls and coordinated with a small local funeral home, ensuring that everything would be handled with dignity. She explained things to Eli as gently as she could, giving him the space to process at his own pace. Andrew arrived later that afternoon, his expression somber as he stepped into the apartment. He carried a bouquet of white lilies, his jaw tight with the effort of holding back emotion. Maggie met him at the door, her arms crossed. "He's not ready to see you," she said bluntly, her voice low. Andrew nodded, his gaze dropping to the flowers in his hands. "I just wanted to help with the arrangements," he said. Maggie hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. "I've already handled most of it," she said, "but if you want to contribute, you can." Andrew placed the lilies on the table, his shoulders slumping. "I should have been here sooner," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Yes, you should have," Maggie replied, her tone sharp. "But now you have a choice. You can either step up and be the father Eli needs, or you can walk away again. He doesn't deserve half-hearted efforts." Andrew nodded, his expression grim. "I won't walk away this time," he said. The next morning, Maggie gently coaxed Eli out of bed and helped him get ready for the service. The boy moved like a shadow of himself, his usual energy replaced by a quiet, heart-wrenching sadness. She dressed him in a small navy suit and combed his hair, kneeling to adjust his tie. "You look very handsome," she said, trying to muster a smile. Eli didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor. At the funeral home, a small group of mourners gathered in the modest chapel. Neighbors, acquaintances, and a few colleagues from Isabel's past filled the pews, their faces solemn. Maggie guided Eli to a seat near the front, keeping a protective arm around his shoulders. Andrew arrived shortly after, his presence tentative. He sat behind Maggie and Eli, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When it was time for the eulogy, Maggie rose to speak. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges as she looked out at the mourners. "Isabel was one of the strongest women I've ever met," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "She loved her son more than anything, and she worked tirelessly to give him the best life she could. Her kindness and resilience touched everyone who knew her. And while her time with us was far too short, her love will live on in Eli." Her voice broke slightly as she glanced at the boy sitting in the front row, his tear-streaked face buried in his hands. Eli was her greatest joy, and she would want us to celebrate her life by supporting and cherishing him. Isabel may be gone, but her spirit will always be with us. When the service ended, Eli clung to Maggie's side as the casket was carried out. At the cemetery, he placed a small drawing he had made on the casket, a picture of him and his mom holding hands under a bright blue sky. "I love you, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll never forget you." Maggie's heart ached as she held him close, silently vowing to honor Isabel's memory by giving Eli the love and support he needed. As the days turned into weeks, Maggie worked tirelessly to create a sense of normalcy for Eli. She enrolled him in school, helped him with his homework, and encouraged him to talk about his feelings. Gradually, the boy began to open up, though the shadow of grief still lingered. Andrew visited regularly, though Eli remained distant. He often sat silently during Andrew's visits, his small hands fidgeting with a toy or a pencil. One evening, Andrew brought a photo album, his hands trembling slightly as he handed it to Eli. "This belonged to your mom," he said quietly. "She kept these photos from when we were young. I thought you might want to see them." Eli hesitated, then opened the album. His small fingers traced the images of a younger Isabel, her face radiant with a smile. Andrew pointed to a picture of them together, their arms wrapped around each other. "That was before you were born," Andrew said, his voice soft. "Your mom was always so full of life. She loved you more than anything, Eli. I know I wasn't there for you before, but I want to be here for you now." Eli looked up at his father, his eyes searching. "You really mean that?" he asked, his voice cautious. Andrew nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do, Eli. I promise." For the first time, Eli gave him a small nod, his expression softening. "Okay," he said quietly. Maggie watched from across the room, her heart swelling with cautious hope. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but this moment was a step in the right direction. As Eli returned to his school and routine, Maggie began to explore ways to honor Isabel's memory. She envisioned a foundation that would help struggling families like theirs, providing support and resources for mothers and children in need. "I'm calling it the Isabel Foundation," she told Andrew one evening. "It's the least I can do to keep her legacy alive." Andrew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She would have loved that," he said, "and I'll help in any way I can." As Maggie moved forward with her plans, she realized that Isabel's strength and love had left an indelible mark on all of them. And while the pain of loss would never fully fade, it had given them a new purpose: to honor her by building a brighter future for Eli. Life after Isabel's funeral was a delicate balancing act for Maggie as she navigated the challenges of caring for Eli while managing her own grief. The boy was fragile yet resilient, his grief manifesting in small, quiet moments. When he lingered by the window at sunset, doodling pictures of his mother, or clutched the photo album Andrew had given him as he drifted to sleep, Maggie watched over him with a fierce sense of responsibility, determined to give him the stability he desperately needed. One afternoon, as Maggie sat in the living room reviewing grant applications for her newly proposed Isabel Foundation, Eli entered with his notebook in hand. "Tia Maggie," he said hesitantly, using the term of affection he had started calling her. "Can I ask you something?" Maggie set the papers aside, giving him her full attention. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Eli climbed onto the couch beside her, his small fingers fiddling with the edge of the notebook. "Do you think my mom is happy now? Wherever she is?" The question caught Maggie off guard, and she took a moment to gather her thoughts. "I think she is," she said gently. "She loved you so much, and knowing you're being taken care of would make her happy." Eli nodded, his brow furrowing. "I miss her every day," he whispered. "I know," Maggie said, pulling him into a hug. "And it's okay to miss her. She'll always be with you, in your heart and in your memories." Eli rested his head against her shoulder, drawing comfort from her warmth. For the first time in days, he felt a small measure of peace. Later that week, Andrew arrived at Maggie's home for one of his scheduled visits with Eli. He carried a bag of art supplies, new markers, sketch pads, and colored pencils. Maggie observed from the kitchen as Eli greeted him with a shy but genuine smile. "I thought we could draw together today," Andrew said, kneeling to Eli's level. "Maybe you could show me how you make your amazing pictures." Eli hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," he said softly. The two sat on the floor, spreading out the supplies. Maggie watched as Andrew tried to engage Eli, asking questions about his drawings and laughing when Eli corrected his wobbly attempts at sketching. Slowly, the boys' walls seemed to lower and the room filled with the sound of quiet laughter. When Andrew left that evening, Maggie walked him to the door. "You're doing well," she said, her tone grudging but sincere. "I'm trying," Andrew replied, his voice tinged with regret. "I just want to make up for lost time." "Don't push him too hard," Maggie cautioned. "He's still processing everything." Andrew nodded, glancing back toward the living room where Eli's latest drawing lay drying on the table. "Thank you, Maggie, for giving me the chance to be in his life." Days turned into weeks, and Maggie poured her energy into launching the Isabel Foundation. The organization quickly gained traction thanks to her connections and relentless drive. With each step forward, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, as if honoring Isabel's memory was helping her heal as well. Eli, too, began to adapt to his new life. He excelled at school, his teachers praising his creativity and enthusiasm. He made new friends and often came home bubbling with stories about his day. Yet, there were moments when his grief surfaced, catching Maggie off guard. Like when he refused to throw away a pair of worn sneakers because his mom had bought them for him, or when he cried silently during a school play because he didn't see her in the audience. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Eli turned to Maggie with a serious expression. "Do you think I'll ever stop missing her?" he asked. Maggie's heart ached at the question. "No," she admitted, stroking his hair. "But missing her means you loved her deeply, and that's a good thing. It means she'll always be a part of you." Eli nodded, his small hand reaching for hers. "I'm glad I have you," he said quietly. Maggie blinked back tears, squeezing his hand. "I'm glad I have you too." Andrew's efforts to bond with Eli continued, and their relationship grew stronger with each passing visit. Andrew took Eli to parks, helped him with his homework, and even attended his school's parent-teacher conferences. While Eli remained somewhat guarded, it was clear he was beginning to trust his father. One day, Andrew surprised Maggie and Eli with tickets to a children's art exhibit at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. "I thought it might be fun to see some paintings and maybe get inspired," Andrew said. Eli's eyes lit up at the idea. "Can we really go?" he asked, his voice brimming with excitement. "Of course," Andrew replied, ruffling his hair. The outing was a resounding success. Eli was mesmerized by the vibrant paintings and sculptures, peppering Andrew and Maggie with questions about the artists and their techniques. At one point, he stopped in front of a massive mural and turned to Andrew. "Do you think I could be an artist someday?" he asked. Andrew crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I don't think so," he said with a grin. "I know so. You have so much talent, Eli." The boy beamed, his confidence growing with each word of encouragement. Maggie watched the exchange with a mix of pride and relief, grateful that Eli was beginning to find joy again. But despite the progress, there were still challenges. One evening, as Maggie was tucking Eli into bed, he hesitated before asking, "Tia Maggie, why didn't my dad stay when I was little?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She sat beside him, choosing her words carefully. "Your dad made a mistake, Eli," she said gently. "He wasn't ready to be a father back then, but he knows now how important you are, and he's trying to make things right." Eli frowned, pulling the blankets up to his chin. "What if he leaves again?" Maggie leaned down, brushing his hair back. "He won't," she said firmly. "And if he ever tries, I'll stop him. You're not alone, Eli. You'll always have me." The boy seemed reassured, his small hand slipping into hers as he drifted off to sleep. As the Isabel Foundation prepared for its official launch, Maggie invited Andrew to be part of the opening event. The foundation had already gained support from prominent donors and local leaders, and Maggie was determined to make the event a success. "I want you to speak," she told Andrew during one of their meetings. Andrew looked surprised. "Me? What would I even say?" "Talk about Isabel," Maggie said. "About what this foundation means to her memory and to families like hers. It's important for people to understand the impact we're trying to make." Andrew hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." On the night of the launch, the foundation's headquarters was filled with guests, the air buzzing with anticipation. Maggie stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she addressed the crowd. "This foundation was inspired by a remarkable woman," she began, her voice steady. "Isabel was a mother who faced unimaginable challenges, but her love and strength were unwavering. She taught us that no matter how difficult life becomes, love can carry us through." The audience listened intently as Maggie outlined the foundation's mission to provide resources and support for struggling families. She then invited Andrew to speak, stepping aside as he approached the podium. Andrew's voice was filled with emotion as he recounted his regrets and his journey to reconnect with his son. "Isabel showed me the importance of forgiveness and second chances," he said. "Through this foundation, we hope to honor her legacy by helping others find hope and healing." Eli sat in the front row, his small hands clasped in his lap. When Andrew finished his speech, Eli stood and ran to him, throwing his arms around his father's waist. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the room. As Maggie watched the heartfelt moment between father and son, she felt a sense of closure. Isabel's memory had not only brought them together, but had also given them a new purpose: to build a brighter future for Eli and others like him. Though the path ahead would still hold its challenges, Maggie knew they would face it together as a family. The days following the launch of the Isabel Foundation were a whirlwind of activity. Maggie's schedule was filled with meetings, press calls, and donor visits. Yet, amid the chaos, she made a conscious effort to keep Eli's life as normal as possible. Their mornings were spent over breakfast, Eli chattering about school while Maggie made sure his backpack was packed and his hair was neatly combed. In the evenings, they shared quiet moments, whether watching his favorite movies or working on his school projects. Eli was thriving in many ways, his confidence growing as he adjusted to his new life. He had made friends at school, his creativity was flourishing, and his bond with Maggie deepened every day. But there were still moments when his grief would surface unexpectedly, a quiet tear during bedtime or a sudden melancholy when he came across something that reminded him of Isabel. Maggie stayed patient, knowing that healing was a journey and not a destination. Andrew's presence in Eli's life became more consistent. He made an effort to attend school events, pick Eli up from after-school activities, and spend weekends together. Despite their rocky start, their bond was slowly forming. Andrew was learning how to be a father, and though Eli remained cautious, his trust in his father was growing with each interaction. One Saturday morning, Andrew arrived at Maggie's house holding a basketball. Eli opened the door, his face lighting up with surprise. "What's that for?" he asked, eyeing the ball curiously. "I thought we could shoot some hoops," Andrew said, smiling. "There's a court not far from here. What do you say?" Eli hesitated, glancing at Maggie, who stood behind him. She nodded encouragingly. "Go have fun," she said. Eli grabbed his sneakers and followed Andrew outside. At the court, Andrew taught Eli the basics, showing him how to dribble and shoot. The boy laughed as the ball ricocheted off the rim, and Andrew cheered him on with every attempt. By the end of the afternoon, Eli was sweaty and exhausted, but his face was beaming with pride. "That was awesome," he said, clutching the ball. "You did great," Andrew said, ruffling his hair. "We'll do it again soon." When they returned to Maggie's house, Eli ran inside to show her his new basketball moves. Maggie watched him with a smile, her heart warming at his joy. Andrew lingered by the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "He's a special kid," Andrew said softly. "He is," Maggie agreed. "And he's starting to trust you. Don't let him down." Andrew nodded, his gaze fixed on Eli as the boy bounced the ball in the living room. "I won't," he said firmly. As the weeks passed, Maggie found herself juggling more responsibilities than ever. The Isabel Foundation's programs were expanding rapidly, and her work at the ballet school demanded her attention. Despite the growing demands, she remained steadfast in her commitment to Eli, ensuring that he always felt loved and supported. One evening, Maggie received an unexpected call from Eli's teacher, Mrs. Grayson. The older woman's voice was warm but concerned. "Mrs. West," she began, "I want to let you know about something that happened in class today." Maggie's heart tightened. "Is Eli okay?" "He's fine," Mrs. Grayson reassured her. "But during art time, the students were asked to draw their families. Eli's drawing was revealing. He included you, Andrew, and himself, but he drew his mother in the sky, watching over them." Maggie felt a lump rise in her throat. "What did he say about it?" "He said it makes him happy to think she's still with him, even if she's not here," Mrs. Grayson explained. "But I thought you should know, in case he needs extra support." "Thank you for letting me know," Maggie said, her voice tight. "I'll talk to him." That evening, Maggie sat with Eli at the kitchen table, helping him with his math homework. She watched him carefully, noting the way he chewed on his pencil and furrowed his brow in concentration. "Eli," she said gently, "Mrs. Grayson told me about the picture you drew today. It was beautiful." Eli glanced up, his expression wary. "Did I do something wrong?" "Not at all," Maggie reassured him. "I think it's wonderful that you see your mom as always watching over you. It means she's still a big part of your life." Eli nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to the table. "I just don't want to forget her," he said quietly. "You never will," Maggie said, reaching for his hand. "She'll always be in your heart, no matter what." Eli looked up at her, his small face filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Thanks, Tia Maggie," he said, "for everything." One afternoon, as Maggie prepared dinner, Andrew arrived with a small, worn box in his hands. "I found this while cleaning out some old storage," he said, setting the box on the counter. Maggie opened it, her breath catching as she saw its contents: photos, letters, and small trinkets from Andrew's past with Isabel. There was a Polaroid of them at a park, a crumpled movie ticket stub, and a letter Isabel had written but never sent. "She kept all of this?" Maggie asked, her voice thick with emotion. Andrew nodded. She was good at holding on to memories. Eli entered the kitchen and spotted the box. "What's that?" he asked, peering inside. "These are some things your mom kept," Andrew explained. "Would you like to look at them with me?" Eli hesitated, then nodded. They sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the box together. Andrew shared stories about each item, painting a picture of Isabel as a vibrant, loving woman. Eli listened intently, his small fingers tracing the edges of the photos. When they reached the letter, Andrew hesitated, then handed it to Eli. "This is from your mom," he said. "You should read it." Eli unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the words. Maggie watched as his expression shifted. First curious, then emotional. When he finished, he clutched the letter to his chest. "She really loved me," he said, his voice trembling. "She did," Andrew said, his own eyes glistening. "More than anything." The moment was profound, a shared connection between father and son that brought them closer than ever before. Maggie felt a swell of hope, knowing that Eli was beginning to heal in ways she had prayed for. As the Isabel Foundation prepared for its first major event, a fundraiser gala, Maggie threw herself into the preparations. The gala would be a chance to showcase the foundation's impact and attract more supporters. She worked tirelessly, coordinating with vendors, crafting speeches, and ensuring every detail was perfect. Eli, curious about the event, often watched her work. One evening, as she finalized seating charts, he approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Can I help?" he asked. Maggie smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course. What would you like to do?" Eli thought for a moment, then grinned. "I could draw something for the gala. Maybe a big picture to show how the foundation helps people." "That's a wonderful idea," Maggie said, her heart swelling with pride. Eli spent the next few days creating a vibrant mural depicting families smiling and holding hands, with a glowing figure in the sky. Maggie recognized the figure as Isabel and felt tears sting her eyes. The gala was a resounding success. Eli's mural was displayed prominently, drawing admiration from guests. Maggie's speech was heartfelt and inspiring, and Andrew shared his journey of reconnecting with Eli, earning applause from the audience. At the end of the evening, as they stood together under the glittering lights of the ballroom, Eli looked up at Maggie and Andrew with a contented smile. "Mom would be proud of us, wouldn't she?" he asked. "She would be," Maggie said, her voice steady. "She'd be so proud of you, Eli." As they left the gala, walking hand in hand, Maggie felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. Despite the challenges and heartache, they had come together as a family, united by love and a shared determination to honor Isabel's legacy. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, the future felt bright. The success of the gala marked a turning point for the Isabel Foundation, bringing in an influx of donations and partnerships that allowed Maggie to expand its reach. Programs were launched to provide housing assistance, job training, and childcare support to struggling families. Maggie poured her heart into the work, feeling a deep sense of purpose in helping others as a way to honor Isabel's memory. Eli, too, was thriving in the wake of the gala. His confidence grew as he saw how his mural had resonated with people, and he became increasingly involved in the foundation's activities. Maggie encouraged his creativity, giving him space to express himself through art. But despite the progress, there were moments when his grief bubbled to the surface, reminding everyone that healing was not a linear process. One afternoon, while helping Maggie organize donated items at the foundation's headquarters, Eli came across a box of children's books. His face lit up as he sifted through the colorful covers. "Can I take some of these home?" he asked, holding up a few titles. "Of course," Maggie said, smiling. "Take as many as you like." Eli carried the books to a nearby table and began flipping through them. As Maggie watched him, her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up to see a text from Andrew. "Can I pick Eli up this weekend? I want to show him something special." "Curious," Maggie replied. "What do you have in mind?" Andrew's response was almost immediate. "It's a surprise, but I think he'll love it. Trust me." Maggie hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Andrew had been consistent in his efforts to bond with Eli, and she wanted to encourage their growing relationship. That weekend, Andrew arrived bright and early, his excitement evident as he greeted Maggie and Eli at the door. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked Eli, who grinned and nodded. Maggie waved them off, her heart warming at the sight of Eli's joy. She spent the morning catching up on work, but her mind kept drifting to what Andrew might be planning. Hours later, they returned, Eli bursting through the door with excitement. "Tia, Maggie, guess what?" he exclaimed, his face glowing. "What?" Maggie asked, setting aside her papers. "Dad took me to this amazing art studio," Eli said, practically bouncing on his feet. "They had all kinds of paints and canvases, and I got to make my own painting." Andrew followed behind, carrying a large canvas wrapped in brown paper. "He's a natural," Andrew said, beaming. Maggie helped Eli unwrap the canvas, revealing a vibrant painting of a sunny landscape. The colors were bold and expressive, showcasing Eli's unique style. "This is incredible, Eli," Maggie said, her voice filled with pride. "You're so talented." Eli grinned, his cheeks flushing with pride. "I want to do more," he said. Andrew knelt beside him. "The studio offers classes," he said. "If you want, I can take you there on weekends." Eli's eyes lit up. "Really? That would be awesome." Maggie watched the exchange, her heart swelling with gratitude. Andrew was stepping up in ways she hadn't expected, and it was clear that Eli was beginning to trust him more. Over the next few weeks, Andrew and Eli spent more time together at the art studio, their bond strengthening with each visit. Eli's paintings became more confident and intricate, reflecting his growing sense of self. Maggie often joined them for their sessions, marveling at Eli's talent and the progress he was making. But despite the strides they were all making, an undercurrent of uncertainty lingered. Andrew had expressed his desire to be more involved in Eli's life, but Maggie couldn't shake the fear that his commitment might waver. She carried the weight of Isabel's trust, determined to protect Eli from any potential heartbreak. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Andrew broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "Maggie," he began cautiously, "I've been thinking about something important." Maggie set down her fork, her gaze steady. "What is it?" Andrew glanced at Eli, who was busy doodling on a napkin. Lowering his voice, he continued, "I'd like to take on more responsibility for Eli, maybe even move closer, so I can be more present in his daily life." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "That's a big step," she said carefully. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of commitment?" "I am," Andrew said firmly. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to be there for him. I want to give him the stability he deserves." Eli looked up from his drawing, sensing the seriousness of the conversation. "Are you talking about me?" he asked, his voice curious. Andrew smiled. "We are. I was telling Maggie that I want to spend more time with you, "Bud, how would you feel about that?" Eli's brow furrowed as he considered the question. "Does that mean you'd be here all the time?" "Not all the time," Andrew said. "But I'd be around a lot more. We could do more fun things together, like painting and basketball." Eli nodded slowly. "I think that would be okay," he said. Maggie watched the exchange, her emotions a mix of hope and hesitation. She wanted Eli to have a strong relationship with his father, but she couldn't ignore the responsibility she had taken on. In the weeks that followed, Andrew followed through on his promise. He found a small apartment nearby and began integrating himself more fully into Eli's routine. He attended parent-teacher conferences, cheered at school events, and even joined Maggie for planning sessions at the Isabel Foundation. One day, as they worked together at the foundation's office, Andrew turned to Maggie with a question. "Do you think Isabel would be proud of us?" Maggie paused, her pen hovering over her notebook. "I think she would," she said quietly. She wanted Eli to be happy and loved, and that's what we're trying to do. Andrew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I still think about her every day," he admitted, "about how much I let her down. I just hope I'm doing enough now to make up for it." "You're doing what you can," Maggie said. "That's all anyone can ask." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from Eli's school. Maggie answered, her heart sinking as the teacher explained that Eli had gotten into an argument with another student during recess. When Maggie and Andrew arrived at the school, they found Eli sitting in the principal's office, his face flushed with anger and tears. He glanced up at them, his eyes brimming with guilt. "What happened?" Maggie asked, kneeling beside him. "The other kid said something mean about my mom," Eli mumbled, his voice shaking. "He said she left me because she didn't love me." Maggie's heart broke at his words. "That's not true, Eli," she said firmly. "Your mom loved you more than anything. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt that." Andrew placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You stood up for her, and I'm proud of you for that," he said. "But next time, talk to a teacher instead of letting it turn into a fight, okay?" Eli nodded, his tears spilling over. "I miss her so much," he whispered. "We know, Bud," Andrew said, pulling him into a hug. "We miss her too." As they drove home, Maggie and Andrew reassured Eli that he was surrounded by people who loved him and that his mother's memory would always be honored. Though the incident was painful, it brought them closer as a family, strengthening the bonds they had worked so hard to build. That night, as Maggie tucked Eli into bed, he looked up at her with wide, earnest eyes. "Do you think Mom can see us?" he asked. Maggie smiled, brushing his hair back. "I think she's watching over us every day," she said. "And I think she's very proud of you." Eli's face softened, and he snuggled into his blanket. "I hope so," he murmured. As Maggie turned off the light and closed the door, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the progress they had made. The road ahead would still be challenging, but together, they were building a life that honored Isabel's legacy, a life filled with love, resilience, and hope. As summer approached, Maggie, Eli, and Andrew settled into a new rhythm that blended their lives more closely. Maggie's home became the hub for their small but growing family, where dinners, art projects, and quiet evenings together fostered a deep sense of belonging for Eli. The once fractured pieces of his life seemed to be coming together, but the scars of loss still lingered. Eli's drawings had shifted over the months. Once somber and heavy, they now reflected a mix of light and hope. He often painted scenes of a sunny field or a family of three, always including Maggie, Andrew, and himself. One afternoon, as Maggie worked in her study, Eli brought her a painting that caught her breath. "This is beautiful, Eli," she said, studying the vibrant scene of a boy reaching toward a glowing star. "What's it about?" Eli grinned shyly. "It's about me. I think the star is Mom. She's always up there, but I can feel her close when I look for her." Maggie felt a lump in her throat, overcome by the depth of his imagination. "She would love this," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "She'd be so proud of you." That evening, Andrew joined them for dinner. carrying a small package under his arm. "I brought something special," he announced, setting the package on the table. Eli eyed it curiously. "What is it?" Andrew unwrapped the package to reveal an old photo album, its edges worn from years of use. "This belonged to your mom," he said. "I found it when I was going through some things. I thought you might like to see it." Eli reached for the album, his fingers trembling with excitement. As he flipped through the pages, his face lit up with recognition. There were photos of Isabel as a child, pictures of her and Andrew when they were young, and snapshots of Isabel holding a baby Eli. "She's so pretty," Eli whispered, tracing her face in one of the photos. "And look, that's me," Andrew chuckled, leaning over to point at another picture. "And this one was taken on your first birthday. You smashed cake everywhere, and your mom couldn't stop laughing." Eli giggled, his eyes sparkling with delight. Maggie watched the scene with a warm heart, grateful for the memories being shared. The following weekend, Andrew suggested a trip to the mountains for some fresh air and bonding time. "It's a chance for us to get away and just be together," he said. Maggie hesitated. The idea of a trip was appealing, but she worried about Eli's reaction to leaving the familiarity of home. "Do you think he's ready for something like this?" she asked. Andrew nodded. "He's been doing so well, and I think he'd love it. Besides, it's just for a day. We'll keep it simple." When they presented the idea to Eli, his excitement was immediate. "Can I bring my sketchbook?" he asked. "Of course," Andrew said. "You can draw all the trees and animals we see." The trip turned out to be a success. They hiked through lush trails, stopped by a crystal-clear lake, and enjoyed a picnic under the shade of tall pines. Eli's laughter echoed through the forest as he ran ahead, collecting rocks and pointing out birds. Maggie and Andrew exchanged smiles, their shared pride in Eli's happiness evident. As the sun began to set, they reached a scenic overlook that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. Eli sat on a rock, sketching the landscape, while Maggie and Andrew stood nearby. "He's amazing," Andrew said quietly, watching Eli. "I wish Isabel could see this." "She does," Maggie said, her voice firm. "In her own way, she sees everything." Andrew nodded, his expression contemplative. "I know I've said it before, but thank you, Maggie, for everything you've done for him, for us. I don't know where we'd be without you." "You don't have to thank me," Maggie said, her gaze never leaving Eli. "He's my family now, too." On the drive back, Eli fell asleep in the back seat, his sketchbook clutched to his chest. Maggie turned to Andrew with a soft smile. "You're doing better with him," she said. "He's starting to trust you." "I'm starting to trust myself," Andrew admitted, "and that's because of him and you." Their peaceful bubble was disrupted the following week when Maggie received a call from Eli's school. The principal explained that Eli had been withdrawn and distracted in class, and his teacher was concerned. "I'm not sure what's going on," the principal said, "but it might help to talk to him." Maggie hung up, her mind racing. When Eli came home that afternoon, she gently pressed him for answers. "Your teacher said you've been quiet at school," she said. "Is something bothering you?" Eli shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "It's nothing." Maggie knelt beside him, her tone soft but firm. "Sweetheart, you can tell me anything. I'm here to help." After a long silence, Eli finally spoke. "Some kids said I was lucky to have a new dad and a cool aunt, but it made me feel like they think I forgot about Mom." Maggie's heart ached at his words. "Eli, no one could ever replace your mom. She's a part of you, and she always will be. But it's okay to let other people love you too." Eli sniffled, his eyes brimming with tears. "What if I forget her someday?" "You won't," Maggie said, pulling him into a hug. "She's in your heart and in everything you do. Loving others doesn't mean you're letting go of her. It means you're letting her love live on." That night, as Maggie lay awake, she reflected on Eli's struggle to balance his memories of Isabel with the new relationships in his life. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience and reassurance. The next day, Maggie sat down with Andrew to discuss what had happened. He's still figuring out how to hold onto her while moving forward, she explained. Andrew nodded, his brow furrowed. I'll do whatever it takes to help him. He needs to know it's okay to love us and miss her at the same time. Together, they came up with a plan to create a memory garden in Maggie's backyard, a space where Eli could honor Isabel's memory. They spent the weekend planting flowers, arranging stones, and setting up a small bench. Eli helped design the space, choosing bright marigolds and a wind chime shaped like a star. When the garden was finished, Eli stood back to admire their work. It's perfect, he said, his voice filled with pride. Maggie knelt beside him. Whenever you miss her, you can come here, she said. It's your special place to remember her. Eli smiled, his fingers brushing the petals of a marigold. Thanks, Tia Maggie. And thanks, Dad, he added, glancing at Andrew. Andrew's chest swelled with emotion. Anytime, Bud. She'd love it. As they stood in the garden, the wind chime tinkling softly in the breeze, Maggie felt a profound sense of peace. They were building a life that honored Isabel's legacy while creating new memories together. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay. The memory garden became a cherished sanctuary for Eli. Each evening, he would spend time there, sometimes drawing in his sketchbook, sometimes sitting quietly and watching the wind chime sway in the breeze. For Maggie and Andrew, the garden symbolized more than just a connection to Isabel. It was a testament to the resilience of their small family and a reminder of the love that bound them together. The Isabel Foundation also flourished, expanding its reach to help more families in need. Maggie juggled her responsibilities with a determination that inspired everyone around her. Eli often accompanied her to the foundation, proudly showcasing his artwork and offering a child's perspective on their projects. The boy had become a symbol of the foundation's mission, finding hope and healing after hardship. As the foundation planned its second major gala, Maggie felt a surge of anticipation. This year's event would focus on education, unveiling a scholarship program in Isabel's name to help children from disadvantaged backgrounds access quality schooling. Maggie poured her heart into the preparations, involving Eli and Andrew in every step. One afternoon, while they worked on invitations at the kitchen table, Eli spoke up with an idea. "Can I do a painting for the gala?" he asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "Of course," Maggie said, smiling. "What do you want to paint?" Eli thought for a moment, then grinned. "Something about family, like how even when things are hard, you can still find love." Maggie's chest tightened at his words. "That sounds perfect," she said softly. Eli spent the next few weeks creating a stunning piece that depicted a family standing together under a tree, their arms intertwined as a bright star shone above them. Maggie and Andrew were in awe of his talent and the depth of emotion he poured into his work. The night of the gala arrived, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Maggie, dressed in an elegant navy gown, stood by the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Eli's painting was displayed prominently at the center of the venue, drawing admiration from everyone who saw it. Andrew joined Maggie, looking dapper in a tailored suit. "You've outdone yourself this time," he said, gesturing to the beautifully decorated ballroom. "We've outdone ourselves," Maggie corrected, smiling. "This wouldn't have been possible without you and Eli." The event began with a heartfelt speech from Maggie, who highlighted the foundation's accomplishments and shared stories of the families they had helped. Andrew followed with a personal testimony, speaking about his journey to reconnect with Eli and honor Isabel's legacy. As the speeches concluded, Eli walked onto the stage, holding a microphone nervously. Maggie and Andrew watched from the side, their hearts swelling with pride. "This is my painting," Eli said, pointing to the artwork displayed behind him. "It's about how families can be together, even when they're apart. My mom is the star in the painting because she's always with us." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Maggie and Andrew joined Eli on stage, wrapping him in a hug as the crowd cheered. After the gala, as they drove home, Eli was unusually quiet in the back seat. Maggie glanced at him in the rearview mirror, sensing he had something on his mind. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" she asked. Eli hesitated before speaking. "Do you think Mom saw the painting?" Maggie's heart ached at the question. "I do," she said firmly. "And I think she's so proud of you, Eli. You showed everyone tonight how special she was, and how special you are too." Eli smiled faintly, leaning his head against the window. "I hope she knows how much I love her." "She does," Andrew said from the passenger seat. "And she loves you just as much." As they pulled into the driveway, the night felt calm and full of promise. Eli carried a sketchbook inside, his steps lighter than usual. Maggie and Andrew followed, sharing a look of quiet understanding. The weeks after the gala brought new milestones for their family. Eli began taking art classes at a nearby community center, his talent blossoming under the guidance of a skilled instructor. Andrew became more involved in his daily life, helping with homework and attending school events. Maggie continued to balance her roles as caretaker, foundation leader, and mentor, finding strength in the love she shared with Eli and Andrew. One evening, as they sat together in the memory garden, Eli looked up at the star-filled sky. "Do you think families are like stars?" he asked suddenly. Maggie tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "Even if they're far apart, they're still connected," Eli explained. "Like how the stars make constellations." Maggie smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," she said. Andrew reached out, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "And you, my boy, are the brightest star in our constellation," he said warmly. Eli grinned, his eyes twinkling with happiness. As the seasons changed, Maggie reflected on how far they had come. The pain of losing Isabel would never fully fade, but their family had found a way to honor her memory by embracing love and resilience. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Maggie and Andrew watched Eli play basketball in the driveway, Andrew turned to Maggie with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What's that?" Maggie asked, her curiosity piqued. "I'd like to formalize things," Andrew said. "Make our family official. I want Eli to know that he has a father who's committed to being there for him, no matter what." Maggie smiled, her eyes shining with approval. "He'd like that," she said. When Andrew shared the idea with Eli, the boy's reaction was immediate and full of joy. "Really?" he asked, his face lighting up. "Really," Andrew said, pulling him into a hug. "I'm here for the long haul, buddy. You can count on that." The day they signed the official documents, Maggie stood by their side, her heart brimming with pride and love. Eli now had the stability and support he needed, and their family felt complete. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Eli raised his glass of milk in a toast. "To family," he said with a big smile. "To family," Maggie and Andrew echoed, clinking their glasses. As they laughed and shared stories, the house felt warmer and more alive than it had in years. The journey had been difficult, but they had built something beautiful together, a family grounded in love, trust, and the enduring memory of Isabel. Under the stars that night, Maggie whispered a silent promise to Isabel. "Your son is safe, and your legacy lives on. We'll keep shining for you and for him." Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care